and 9.6, we are going to be factoring quadratic trinomials. So your goal number 1 is to factor quadratic trinomial when a is equal to 1. And then second goal will be to factor quadratic when a is not 1. Okay, so very first thing you have to know is that the standard form of a quadratic expression is ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is in front of the x squared, b is in front of the x, and c is your constant. So I'm going to show you how to factor this. So we're going backwards. So when we FOIL or distribute the when we distribute x plus 2 times x minus 3, what we get is, when you FOIL this together, we get x squared, and then we got negative 3x, and then we got positive 2x and minus 6. And then we know that these two are my like terms, so what I end up with is x squared minus 1x minus 6. So this is the multiple when we multiply two linear binomials together. So when we FOIL this together, this is what we get. So what our goal for today is we're going to factor. So we multiply, so factor means to break down. So this is going to be what's given, and we're going to take through the steps to get here, and then we're going to try to find the answer, which is this is the factor of this. So we're going to use a method called factor by grouping, and we could use that method for any quadratic functions, even when a is 1 or when a is not 1. And I'm going to go through each step to get to show you how to factor by grouping. Okay, so if I want to, I'm going to use the same equation, and I'm going to show you how to go back. So your question that's going to ask you to do is to factor x squared minus x minus 6. So my steps involved are, so in step 1, what I want you to do is find your ABC. So I can see that a is the number in front of the x squared, and remember, if there's no number, it's 1. And then b is negative 1. And c is negative 6. So very first thing I want you to do is find your ABCs. And then step 2 is we're going to multiply. I want you to multiply, so that's what M stands for. Multiply a times c. And when you multiply a times c, I get 1 times negative 6, which is negative 6. I want you to multiply those two numbers. And then I want you to tell me what b is. And we're going to use the S means the sum, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So b is negative 1. So locate your negative 1. Now, so once you have those done, in step 3, what we're going to do is we're going to find the products or the factors of negative 6. So we're looking for the factors of negative 6 that would add up to, so this S means the sum. I call it sum of b. I want to know what two numbers that you have to multiply together to get negative 6 that would add up to negative 1. So we're looking for those factors. So for negative 6, I could do 1 times negative 6, like we did up here. That's negative 6. But if I did 1 plus negative 6, I get negative 5. So this isn't the factor. And then I could do 2 times negative 3. Well, 2 times negative 3 is also negative 6. Now if I do 2 plus negative 3, I get negative 1. And this is the factors I'm looking for. So I want to know what two numbers that multiply together to negative 6. And if I add those numbers together, that gave me negative 6. Am I also going to get negative 1? And the reason why is we want to take these numbers and we're going to split the middle term. So see how we combine the two middle terms to get this? We're going backwards. We want to split it back up. So the split, which is going to be my step 4, I call it a split. Okay, and we're going to split into, so this right here splits into 2x plus negative 3x. Because 2x plus negative 3x becomes negative 1x. So now we're going backwards. So we're going to, before we combine it, now we're going to break it up. So now we bring down the rest, x squared plus 2x and minus 6. So now we break it up. And then what we're going to do is step 5, and I call this step 5, is to group. And this is why it's called factor by grouping. So we're going to group. And I am going to group the first two. So here's my grouping the first two. And we're going to group the second two. Group. Now once we group, we want to find the greatest common factor in the first group. So we call that step 6. We're going to factor. And then we're going to factor. Factor the first, factor the second. Okay? So greatest common factor between x squared and 2x is x. Right? X could go into both, so we factor out the x. That's my greatest common factor. And when you factor it out and you're dividing it out, so it's like dividing it out. So x squared divided by x. Remember, x squared is x times x. One of the x's cancel out. So I have x left. And then 2x divided by x, x's cancel out, I get plus 2. So x times x plus 2 is the factor of x squared plus 2x. And then between negative 3x and negative 6, greatest common factor is negative 3. And I always want the x to be positive. So whenever there's a negative in front of it, you want to take out the negative. So you factor out the negative 3. And the factor, if I factor that out, so divide it out, negative 3 cancels out, I get x. And negative 6 divided by negative 3 is positive 2. So this is the factor of this, and this is the factor of this. Now, the very last step will give you your answer. Now, when you factor, you have to make sure that this right here and that right there are the same. If they're not the same, you did something wrong. And since they're the same thing, what we're going to do is, as a whole, we're going to factor one more time, and that will be your step 7. Factor one more time as a whole. So if you notice, this right here and this right here, they're my greatest common factor as a whole. So you pull that out, x plus 2, and then when you divide by x plus 2, they cancel out, and what's remaining right here, x minus 3, goes in the other parentheses, x minus 3. And that is the factor of the trinomial x squared minus x minus 6, which we just started with up here. So see, when we FOIL this back together, we should get this. So the way to check is to multiply that out, FOIL it out, and then you get this. And that's how you check. And this is FOILing. Factoring by grouping. Okay, so let's try one more. Second, let's factor. So we're going to go through all the steps again. So we're going to factor x squared plus 8x plus 15. So same thing again. We're going to look for our ABCs. A is equal to 1, and B equals 8, and C equals 15. Now we're going to do the multiples of A times C, which is 1 times 15, which is 15. So I want to know what factors of 15, and then my sum of B. B has to equal 8, right? B is 8. So I want to know what times what is 15 that would add up to 8. All right. So if you notice, I know that 3 times 5 is 15. And 3 plus 5, those two same numbers, they add up to 8. So those are my factors. These are the two numbers that we're going to split up the middle term. So we're going to come over here and split. So this becomes x squared. This becomes plus 3x plus 5x, because they add up to 8x plus 15. So we did step number 1, step number 2, step number 3. We found the multiple. Step number 4 was to split. And now next thing we're going to do is we're going to group. Group. Once we group, we're going to find a factor. We're going to factor this out, and we're going to factor that out. To factor out, we're going to find the greatest common factor. So greatest common factor between x squared and 3x is x. So you factor out the x. And when you factor out, you gotta just like dividing it out. So we're gonna divide x squared divided by x is just x, because x times x is x squared, so one of the x's cancels out. And x cancels out, so plus 3. Between 5x and 15, 5 is the greatest common factor, so you factor out the plus 5. And then when you divide it out, 5 cancels out, I got x. And then 15 divided by 5 is 3. And I know I did it correctly because these two are exactly the same. So once we have that, this is my greatest common factor as a whole. So you factor out the x plus 3. And then when you divide by x plus 3, all of it cancels out. So then what's remaining would be x plus 5. And x plus 3 and x plus 5 are the factors of x squared plus 8x plus 15. And this is when, this is called factor by grouping. And if you noticed, when a is 1, okay, see the factors you found, 3 and 5? Those are the two numbers that will go in here as a factor of this. Because x squared plus 8x plus 15, when you want to factor, remember this comes from, this is your first. So what times what gives me x squared? And you could say x and x. This is my inside outside, and this is my last. So what times what gives me 15? Well, 3 and 5 gave me 18 because it adds up to 8. So 3 and 5 go in there, and they were both positive. So this will be the factor of x squared plus 8x plus 15. So this only works for when a is equal to 1. Now I'm going to show you when a does not equal 1. So this is when a does not equal. So I'm going to factor. So this is, the first two were from 9.5. This is 9.6. So we are going to factor 20x squared 20x squared plus 17x plus 3. And we're going to use the same steps again. Step 1 is to find your ABC. So my A is this time is 20, so it's not 1. So, and then B is 17 and C is 3. So that's your step 1. Find your ABCs. Now step 2, finding your MAC. Finding your multiples of A times C. So we're going to do multiples of A times C, which is 20 times 3, which is 60. So 60 is the numbers that we're looking for. We're going to know what factors of 60, and the sum of B has to equal 17. So I want to know what two numbers that multiply together to 60 that would add up to 17. So I know that 2 times 30 is 60. 2 plus 30 gives me 32, so that's not it. And then I could do 3 times 20, that's 60. 3 plus 20 gives me 23, so that's not it. I could do, let's do 5 times 12. That also gives me 60. 5 plus 12, guess what? That gives me 17. That's what we want. We want it to add up to 17. And these are the factors that we're going to use to split this middle term up. So here's your step 1. Step 2, locating your multiples of A times C, sum of B, and then go through the process of finding the factors, which is 5 and 12. And then step 4 is to split the middle term. So this becomes 20x squared. 17x splits into positive 5x, a plus 5x, and plus 12x, because they add up to 17x plus 3. So we split, which is step 4. And then step 5 is to group. So we're going to group. Okay, and then we're going to factor. So the greatest common factor between 20x squared and 5x is 5x. So 5x. So we're going to factor out the 5x, and we're going to divide it out and see what's remaining. So when you factor it out, 20 divided by 5 is 4. And x squared divided by x is just x, so 4x. And then 5x divided by 5x. 5x goes into 5x once, because they cancel out, so 4x plus 1. Now the greatest common factor between 12x and 3 is 3, so we're going to factor out the 3, so plus 3, we factor it out, and then we divide it out. So then 12x divided by 3 is 4x, plus 3 divided by 3 is 1. And I know I did it correctly because these two are exactly the same. So I have 4x plus 1 and 4x plus 1 here, so those are my greatest common factors. So we're going to factor it out. So then when you divide by 4x plus 1 and divide by 4x plus 1, they cancel out. And what's remaining would be 5x plus 3. So step 1 is to find your ABCs. Find your multiples of A times C, which is 60. Sum of B is 17. So I want to know what are the factors of 60 that would also add up to 17. Once you have those numbers, you come over here and split the middle terms into 5x and 12x and double check to make sure they equal 17x. After you split, you group the first two, group the second two, and then you factor the first, okay, and factor the second, and make sure that when you factor, these are exactly the same. And when they're the same, you know you factored it correctly, so you factor that out one more time, and then you divide and those cancel, and the rest goes in the other. And so this is the factor of 20x squared plus 17x plus 3. So now if I want to check, I just boil that back together. So 4x plus 1 times 5x plus 3. First, 20x squared, outer plus 12x, inner 5x, last plus 3, and because these are my like terms, 20x squared plus 17x plus 3, and that's what we started with at the beginning right here. So the checks. And this is factoring by grouping.